Now here, the red foxes are still, they're dog-like, but they still are a little bit more different than a wolf, dog, coyote. They have different teeth structure. Okay, in fact, the number of teeth that they have is different. And even now today, even the number of chromosomes, we now know that. He didn't, because they didn't know anything about chromosomes back then, are different numbers. Therefore, he put them, the fox, into a totally different genus to indicate that it is not as similar as wolves, dogs, coyotes. And so he created another genus called Vulpes. In this case, that's Latin for fox. And Canis, Vulpes vulpes. But there's other types of foxes too, besides the red fox. There's a gray fox. And it's still dog-like, but it's still a little different even than the red fox, and therefore it was given a totally different name. Now, as I'm putting up these scientific Linnaean classification, genus, and species names for these animals, I don't expect you to know them. Okay, I'm never going to ask you what is the genus name of a coyote. I'm just doing this for illustration purposes of understanding Linnaean classification, because I'm going somewhere with this. All right, so this is the dog family. However, we can also do this with cats. A lion. Lions are quite different than dogs, or cats are quite different than dogs. Therefore, this is put into the genus Panthera, and it's called Panthera leo. But tigers are very similar. They're not the same, but they're very similar. So they're just like Canis. They're put in the same genus, but given different species names. But there's other types of cats. Just a common cat. Okay, it's still different enough that he put it into a totally different genus, Felis catus, and a cheetah, okay, even in a different genus. Now, when we take and look at wolf, dog, coyote, red fox, gray fox, all of these together have certain characteristics that they have in common that is not shared with the cats, okay? Therefore, what happened with his classification is later he expanded it, okay, to create not just only genus and species, if I get this thing to work, but he linked them together into a larger category called a family, okay? So all these dog-like animals, wolf, gray fox, and so forth, dog family, he gave a Latin name to it, and when we have this ending suffix DAE, it always means family. So this is the family Canidae. And for the cats, well, all these are similar to each other in a broader sense. They share certain characteristics that they don't share with the dogs, like retractable claws and other features of the teeth. And therefore, they're put together in the cat family, okay, Felidae. And there's other families. Okay, Mustelidae. These is the weasel family. So ferrets, otters, badgers, and so forth. This type of animals may not be familiar with. They still put together into a family. Now, all these weasels, ferrets, etc., still have genus assigned to a genus and a species name as well. Now, looking at a broader characteristics of these three families, Canidae, Felidae, and Mustelidae, they, on a broader scale, also share a lot of similarities that they don't share with things like horses, cows, and so forth. And therefore, due to these bigger similarities, all three of these families, plus the bear family and some other families, were put together in yet a bigger, more inclusive category that he referred to as an order. And this is called Carnivora. And so bears, dog family, hyena family, all of these, they have certain teeth characteristics. For example, their molars and premolars, one of the molars and premolars that are fused together as these shearing, cutting edges that are called carnassials. That's unique to carnivores. Horses don't have that. Zebras don't have that. Cows don't have that, and so forth. And then further, when we look at a broader, if we include horses, cows, elephants, giraffes, etc., then they share a broader set of characteristics that carnivores and horses and elephants and whales share together, and therefore they're put together in yet a broader category called a class. All right, so this was his hierarchical classification that he created based on similarities and differences in morphological characters that they could see. So these are the categories of a Linnaean classification, categories, levels. The lowest level, unique, is a species. Usually there's just one group population of organisms that belong to that species, but it is similar. Several different similar species are put into the same genus, several different genera into the same family, several different families into the same order, and the same order, many different orders into the same class, similar classes into a broader group called a phylum, and phylum into a kingdom, and something he didn't have. Okay, this is the categories Linnaeus and his followers produced: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But here lately, we've gone a little bit broader. We've added another one called a domain. Okay, so this is a hierarchical classification system, and it's what he created. Now, why am I going into so much detail here? Is we're talking about biological evolution. And of course, Linnaeus was not an evolutionist. Linnaeus believed that all these organisms had been created by a god and they're not changing, okay? But what is significant about his classification, its hierarchical structure, is it's not like Aristotle's ladder. It is more like a bush. It's more like a tree. And so if I were to go back here to, can I draw? Let me see here. Whatever happened to the pin? Is that it's more like this. If you have here the dog family, cat family, weasel family, I won't spell it all out. Their relationships in this hierarchical classification look more like this. Then if we go off here to horses and cows and so forth, here we have a category that we put together all these into the same genus or into the same family, all these families into the same class, and then all these classes into the same order and so forth, or orders, then classes, sorry about that, orders and then classes. Instead of this being a ladder, like the scale of nature, this is more like a tree. And that fits with biological evolution, okay? He didn't see it. And in fact, he denied that this had anything to do with biological evolution. It was just God's plan to do it this way. But later, evolutionists would look at this and they saw evolutionary branching, okay? Okay, so going back here. So that's what's important about Linnaeus and his contribution to biological evolution. Now, James Hutton is another contributor, okay, to this idea. Now, when I have his year here is 1795, he lived more than 1 year, okay? So this here is just only the year in which he wrote a book. And it wasn't a very popular book because he was a poor writer. However, he was an engineer geologist. So being an engineer, he was very interested in building canals, etc., through landscapes. And so he studied the different types of rocks, okay, different types of rock types. Now, by this time, they understood that there were 3 different types of rocks, okay, in a broad sense. Sedimentary rocks. Igneous rocks. Metamorphic rocks, okay, just broadly. Okay, now what was real important here is, of course, igneous rocks. These are rocks that came from melded material that then solidified, okay, like granite, basalt, and lava. Okay, so they were once molten rock and in a liquid form, very, very hot. And as they cooled down, they crystallized, a lot of the minerals formed, and so forth. Metamorphic rocks, we're not going to say much about them, but well, in fact, let's do sedimentary rock first. Where do sedimentary rocks come from? Sedimentary rocks come from erosion and then the recreation of new rocks, material that has been displaced, usually in lake basins or sea basins. And so here we have sort of a lake or a big sea. And out here on dry land, we may have various types of other types of soils and rock. Eventually, this igneous rock, due to water freezing and it weathers, it breaks down into soil. And that soil eventually will get washed into a basin. These little particles, which we call sediment, will then settle out because they weigh more than the water. And year after year, as we have water running into this basin, some of this soil will form sedimentary layers. Eventually, there'll be pressure, and furthermore, there's a lot of carbon carbonate that happens to be in the water. So this is a lake. It forms sort of a cement between these mineral particles that have come from the breakdown of igneous and metamorphic rock, forming soil. Now, what is it? And so, in fact, you can, all of you have probably had the experience of driving through some cut roadway where you see that the rocks are in very good layers, okay? Each layer is from, a different time period when these sediments were laid down, and later they solidify into rock. This is sedimentary rock. Now, what's important about the sedimentary rock is sometimes there might be an organism that died, okay? And its bones might get washed down here, get buried into the sedimentary rock, and it forms a fossil, okay? All fossil-bearing rock is sedimentary, okay? And so by this time, no, fossils have been formed and found by Native Americans even, we know that, and other societies. And of course, they had usually mythological explanations as to what these things were. And in fact, it was probably the mythology of dragons, both in East Asia and in Europe, because that was a famous mythological organism, probably is derived from dinosaur fossils. Okay, these were the claimed to be the bones of dragons that died long ago, but these came from sedimentary rock. And so it was at fossils, the form of past life. We only find them in sedimentary rocks. And by the time Hutton comes along, people know that. People already understood that the fossils that we find in sedimentary rock happen to be forms of past life. Okay, so that was an important part of, and I'll get back here to Hutton in a moment. I'm not going to say too much about metamorphic rock. All I'm going to say is that this is either sedimentary or igneous rock that has been buried very deeply in the earth and then subject to high pressure and high heat to the point that it changes its form. Okay, it's been under high pressure. If it was sedimentary rock, say limestone contains fossils. It gets metamorphized into marble, okay, because under high pressure and temperatures, it'll change into marble. And of course, that would destroy any fossils that they have there and so forth, okay? But what I'm wanting to get into here about, okay, what happened here. Yeah, Hutton, is that he came to understand these layers of sedimentary rock, that they were laid down over a long period of time. And so he came up with the concept of geological gradualism. And so with that, these lower layers of the sediment, they were laid down a long time ago. And the upper layers are something that happened more recently. Okay, now he was a pretty good guy. He could see that the rainfall creates erosion. Erosion moves that sediment into lake basins or sea basins, and it's at a certain rate. And therefore, when you see all these, how many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, anyone been to the Grand Canyon? Put in chat if you've been to the Grand Canyon. Yes, no, years ago, doesn't matter when. Grand Canyon. No, anyone else? Yeah, yeah, okay. Even if those of you who have not been to the Grand Canyon, you've seen pictures of the Grand Canyon, right? Okay, miles deep of layer after layer after layer after layer after layer of sedimentary rock. Okay, all that sedimentary rock, and it's a good mile deep or so. The point being here is that for evolution, biological evolution to occur, it requires time. Most Europeans at this time, they believe that the Earth was based on the calculations from the Bible. They believed that the Earth was no older than 6,000 years old. And that is not enough time to be able to count for any sort of biological evolution. James Hutton believed that these layers and layers of rock were laid down by natural forces, rainfall, and washing in sediment year after year, building up a new sedimentary layer that then was transformed into rock. And if you look at something like the Grand Canyon, that would have taken a long, long period of time to do, a lot more than 6,000 years old. And so Hutton's contribution was that he introduced into geology natural forces that we see right now as molding our Earth, and it required time. Okay, so these were small changes that accumulated over time, gradualism. Now, most people, and even in your textbook, it won't say too much about James Hutton. They will say a lot about Charles Lyell, L-Y-E-L-L, because he was a contemporary of Darwin, and of course, he was a big geologist, a British geologist as well, but he still stood on the shoulders of James Hutton, okay? All right, then, about the same time in France, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. This is spelled wrong. Just a second here, let me correct that. I meant to change that. There we go, Lamarck. He was a professor of biology and geology of natural sciences at the University of Paris. And this is the time span he lived. So he's still before Darwin. And he wasn't the first European evolutionist, because even Darwin's grandfather believed in gradual biological evolution. And there were other people who pointed out that living things seemed to be changing over time based on fossils, looking at fossil evidence. But one of the things I want to mention about Lamarck, he was very, very important for Darwin's ideas, is that this guy came up, not only insisted biological evolution had occurred, but also he gave at least one of the first explanations, or an attempt at explaining how it happened to come about. And his explanation was the theory of acquired characteristics. So he believed that life started spontaneously in some little mud, okay? And first of all, it turns out to be just only a worm of some sort. So we have a little bit of a worm here that starts, and over time it evolves into an insect. After many, many generations, okay? And then this insect will eventually evolve into a fish, maybe. And after many generations, the fish will become a reptile, that reptile become a bird, and so forth. Okay, so this is a lineage. Okay, that evolution over time, and the way he explained why this changes happens is by acquired characteristics. So what it means here with acquired characteristics is that he believed that the body's an organism would had certain basic needs that it would strive for. Now, one of his best illustrations here was the neck of a giraffe. Giraffes have long necks, and but they started out as short-necked animals. But these giraffes, they're eating the leaves on the tree, and therefore we have an ancestral giraffe that can't quite reach those leaves. It stretches its neck to get to the leaves. And this is an acquired characteristic. It's gaining a slightly longer neck just due to stretching its neck, exercising. And then, but then that slightly longer neck is then passed on to its children. So the next generation, they're born with a slightly longer neck. And then that generation of giraffes, they're stretching their necks, trying to get the leaves. And by just exercise, the neck gets a little bit longer. And then that's passed on to the next offspring. Okay, so over generation after generation, through acquiring these characteristics, striving for a particular goal, is that the necks get longer and longer and longer. And so this is how he explained evolution. Yes, Alquasim.
Would he is there like a certain criteria for something to become a new species in his view?
No, this is what he thought. He thought everything started out as like a worm, okay? And they go through this series of changes. They start a lineage, and it might be that this one that started way late, long time ago, we won't say bird here, let's say mammal, eventually becomes human, which was almost taboo to talk about in his day. Okay, because you could get yourself thrown in jail for that. Human, but nonetheless. But this lineage here, had a completely new origin, and this here may only make it up to the bird scale. And this here starts later, and therefore today it is only a fish. He really didn't say much about speciation. Okay, because this was even, this is almost, Lamarck's classification system was there, but they really didn't talk about speciation because they believed, other than Lamarck, he believed that everything, other people believed everything was created that way. Lamarck, he believed things changed, but he really didn't address when does something become a different species. Okay, but this was his scheme. It's not a branching diagram like results from Darwin. Okay, Long.
Yes, so the change in habits contribute to change in the DNA structures?
No, because they didn't know anything about DNA. Okay, remember that DNA really wasn't characterized until way late in the 19th century. And even then, they didn't know what it was and that it had anything to do with heredity. And if you remember from last semester, we went over all those experiments, Misselson-Stahl experiments and Griffith experiments. And it really wasn't until the 1950s that it was really understood that DNA was the genetic material, much less that DNA changes. And so here they were just based on morphology, just based on the structure of the body, that the structure of the body changes due to striving after a certain goal, and that goal leads to an exercise that changes the structure, and then that gained acquired characteristic is then passed on to the next generation. So after many generations of these giraffes stretching their necks longer and longer, is that they got longer necks. Okay, and so this was his idea of acquired characteristics. So Alquasim, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, So this was Lamarck's idea. However, we know that that acquired characteristics doesn't work, because if this were true, then you could exercise, go to the gym, work out, build up those muscles, and have a baby, and that baby doesn't come out pumping iron. Okay, it doesn't have big muscles just because you did a bunch of exercising. Okay, we know that that doesn't work, and but nonetheless, my point, which is important here about Lamarck, is that he came up with one of the first explanations for how biological, like come up with a theory to explain how things change. Okay, now also at the University of Paris, at the same time as Lamarck, is a guy named Georges Cuvier. Now, he was a strict creationist. He believed that everything had been created, and he and Lamarck hated each other. Okay, they didn't get along at all, but they were contemporaries at the same university. I bring in Cuvier simply because he was a very good vertebrate comparative anatomist. You know, at this time, there was a lot of fossils and also a lot of bones started looking at how do the body of a cow compare to the body of a horse? How does the body of a monkey compare to the body of a human, and so forth? And he would compare parts and see similarities in parts. And this is called comparative anatomy. And the branch of comparative anatomy made big contributions to evolution, because within the bones, within even the soft organs, soft tissues, we can see graded similarities. Okay, I haven't been watching the chat here, but someone is asking, just curious, what are the thoughts on what came first, the chicken or the egg? That is a good question, okay? And no one can answer it, all right? So with regard to evolution, we'll come back to some of this a little bit later on. I'll answer that later. I'll postpone it for now. Okay, so now, one of the things about Georges Cuvier is that he collected a lot of fossils. And so there was a lot of fossil vertebrates from so-called Ice Age around Paris. And of course, those fossils did not correspond directly. They were similar to, but not the same as fossils that were or living organisms that are around the Paris region. And further back, as you go down through the sedimentary rock, the fossils of animals near the top of the column are more similar to ones we have today. And then they change as we go down layer after layer. They become less and less similar to what was around Paris. So the way he didn't believe, as Lamarck did, that this shows that things have changed over time, okay? That the same organisms through an ancestor-descendant relationship, that their bodies have changed. He came up with the idea called catastrophism, in which he explained this. He said that, first of all, there was some sort of catastrophe that wiped out everyone, all the organisms, plants and animals around the Paris Basin. Okay, that's the lowest level. That's why we have those fossils there. And the reason why the next layer of sedimentary rock has slightly different fossils there, their forms are a little bit different, is because after this big catastrophe that destroyed everyone, it was a localized catastrophe. It didn't affect the whole world. It wasn't like the biblical flood that was supposed to have killed everyone, except for Noah and his family. This here then was a local catastrophe, wiped out everyone within the Paris Basin, but these new organisms then colonized from England, from Germany, from the Middle East, etc. And now we have a new set of organisms there. And then a little bit later, they get wiped out by another catastrophe. And so each layer in the sedimentary rock is due to the differences, changes from one level to the next in the stratum of the rock, is due to a catastrophe wiping out everyone, and then new organisms moving in, which have a different mix. Okay, well, that can't go on forever, all right? And so, but nonetheless, this was his explanation, and it didn't go too far. Then along comes Darwin. So I've set the stage here as to the intellectual climate in Europe at this time when Darwin was there. And so evolution was in the air, because Lamarck supported it, and there were others whom I'm not mentioning. They also believed in biological evolution. Still, it was a tricky time, okay, because the church had a lot of power, and they would stamp down a lot of this type of thought. So in about the mid 1800s, there was another individual named, once again, British, his name was Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace. He was doing a lot of collecting in Southeast Asia, and a lot of the islands there. And he I won't go into too much of his story. He independently came up with an explanation for biological evolution, the same explanation that Darwin came up with. However, Darwin had been sitting on this idea since 1836. Okay, we know it, it's in his notes. He called it natural selection. So Lamarck had the idea of how biological evolution can occur by acquired characteristics. We know that that no longer works. But Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection. So sometime in 1858, the Royal Darwin received a manuscript written by Wallace, which was basically given the same idea about natural selection that Darwin had been working on for a couple of decades. Darwin had been afraid to publish his ideas, okay, because it wasn't popular, all right? Nonetheless, once he got Wallace's paper, he talked to some of his friends in the Royal Society of London, and they urged him to write a paper, and they published Russell's paper and Darwin's paper together, or at least they presented it at a society meeting. After which Darwin went to work real vast over the next year to put together a really interesting book, which was published in 1859. It's called On the Origin of Species. It's something that you ought to read sometime in your lifetime. It had very little to do, however, with the origin of species. It had a lot to do with how things change in the biological world. So two major theories, and really this is the Wallace-Darwin theory. We know from notes that they kept that Darwin came to this idea first. And yet even there was one other person who even beat Darwin to this idea of natural selection. And since that individual didn't get the popularity that Darwin got, we won't go into that story. Okay, so his two ideas in this book is one, the theory of natural selection. Okay, he did not come up with the idea of biological evolution. That was already there. A lot of people had already come up with that idea. His is, how does biological evolution occur? That's one thing. He provided a plausible mechanism for biological evolution. Furthermore, unlike Lamarck, where we have life originating again and again and again, independently of each other, then evolving through an ancestor-descendant relationship with many separate lineages, Darwin saw life as originating just once, okay? And then eventually changing down as it branched, speciated, creating a tree of life, okay? Where the branches find their own evolutionary course and change. In other words, from Darwin's viewpoint, all living things are related, all the way from bacteria to oak trees to humans, okay? This is what he called descent with modification, okay? Descent with modification. At this time, they knew nothing about DNA. They had no idea what the basis of heredity happened to be, but they knew, or at least they believed, that things had changed. All life is related, and then that new species. Now, Darwin did get into the idea as to where do new species originate, okay? They come from the splitting of a lineage, okay, and diverging. And we'll go into details in the next lecture about how we think that happens, right? So this was the view of life that what Darwin had, right? And furthermore, so even though during the semester you don't have time to read this book of his, Origin of Species, on the origin of species by natural selection. That's the whole title. Still, we can condense it. His whole book is one log argument. This is his reasoning. And it's based on some observations, which he gave many examples of these observations, and some conclusions that could be deductions that could be drawn from them. One of the observations here is that all species produce more offspring than can possibly survive. And this is, in other words, everything has great reproductive potential. If we happen to have, for example, a housefly in May, female fly that has eggs, she lays her eggs, and if every one of her eggs were to hatch and every one of them to survive, they reproduce and everyone live and survive and reproduce, etc. By the end of the summer, we would have so many flies on Earth that if we killed them off and let them settle, we would have carcasses of flies that would cover the whole world 1 meter deep. Okay, reproductive potential, but that doesn't happen. Okay, so the potential of producing offspring, very high, and that's even true of humans. Okay, that's an observation. We know that not every flower, a daisy, may produce thousands of seeds, but very few of those seeds will ever germinate and grow into a plant. All right, so that's one observation. Second observation is that despite this great reproductive potential, most populations of like daisies or wildflowers or of houseflies, they may go up and down over the seasons, but they stay relatively stable in size. We don't have an Earth covered with flies, okay? They stay. And furthermore, a third observation is one that this is an observation that humans seem to never want to pay attention to, okay, about ourselves, about our own existence, is that natural resources are limited. They don't go on forever. So what we mean by these natural resources, the food that the flies feed on, they have to have breeding grounds, place to lay their eggs. These are all part of their ecology. This is all part of their lifestyle, and these are all resources, and they're not endless. Okay, so these are three ideas, I mean, and you can't dispute them because you can see them, okay? They're observations, hands down, that's the way it is. Now, based on these three, what can you conclude? He made this inference based on these three ideas, is that populations are producing more offspring than the environment can support. The resources are limited, okay? And not everyone can survive. So the inference here is there must, he called it a struggle for existence. Later, he called it the struggle of the fitness, okay? So in other words, since there's more individuals than can be supported by the resources, there must be a struggle, competition for the resources, right? That's the whole point here. Struggle, and so there's winners and there are losers. Not everyone can survive. Called it the struggle of the fitness later on. Right now he called it the struggle for existence, but later he changed it based on another individual named Spencer, who used this term, first used this term, struggle of the fittest. Continuing from this, an observation 4 is that in most cases, no two individuals are exactly alike in their phenotypes, in their physical characteristics. There's differences. Even with flies, they're not the same size. One fly might be faster than another. One might lay more eggs than another, and so forth. There's individual variation. And therefore, second inference, based on the first inference, there's a struggle for the resources. We have individuals that vary, but if something about the variation, if certain individuals have a variation that allows them to utilize these resources better than others, then their chances of surviving and growing to reproductive age is enhanced. And they're most likely will be the winners most of the time. Whereas the others who don't have that advantageous variation will be the losers. And this is the whole idea of natural selection, okay? It's the environment that makes the selection, okay? So individuals they vary, there's a struggle for the resources, there's limited resources, and if there are variations that allow certain individuals to utilize those resources better than other individuals, then they have a better chance of surviving to reproductive age and passing on that characteristic to the next generation. All right, this is natural selection in a nutshell. Exactly what he meant. Now, what is important about this, of course, is Lamarck had no idea about variation, or excuse me, about heredity. Didn't know anything about DNA, and neither did Darwin. But still, for Darwin's idea of natural selection to work, this variation has to be not acquired as Lamarck had it, but it has to be genetically determined. It has to be due to the genetic material, which at this time, Darwin had no idea as to what it was. And we can give a lot of examples that we've seen in in modern times. Is, for example, many bacterial species are now resistant to multiple types of antibiotics, and it's becoming a big problem. Antibiotics were first produced and used against the bacterial diseases starting with the Second World War, okay, with the advances in chemistry. The first antibiotics were isolated from fungi, okay? Fungi were using these compounds to protect their food supply, okay, releasing them into the environment. So penicillin was the first antibiotic, came from a fungus, and we have been using these. Now, at the time, there were some bacteria that were resistant naturally because they had R plasmids. Now, if you remember from last semester, R plasmid, this stands for resistant. These are types of plasmids, circular DNA that not part of the bacterium, but can be in the cytoplasm of the bacterium, and these usually carry genes that are lead to production of proteins that can disable certain antibiotic. Okay, so, and these can be passed from one bacterium to another bacterium through conjugation. However, so we have a group of bacteria here, most of which do not have plasmids, but there's a certain portion of the individuals that do have an R plasmid. The vast majority of the bacteria are without plasmids. And why is that? Because those that have a plasmid, their growth and reproduction is slower. So those bacteria who do not have plasmids, they're able to reproduce faster. But once we change the environment and start using antibiotics, then all of a sudden, these bacteria that have the plasmids, even though they grow slowly compared to other non-plasmid bacteria, they now have an advantage, okay, because they can survive the antibiotic. So with each generation, a larger and larger proportion happen to be those that are resistant. Now, R plasmids are not the only way in which resistance can come about, because there are still some genes on the bacterial genome that can also code for proteins that disable antibiotics. But nonetheless, since then, we've gone through several different classes of new antibiotics, and it's getting a little bit scary because now, for example, there's a Staphylococcus aureus that normally grows in your nose that is resistant to multiple types of antibiotics. And this is due to the overuse, natural selection. And a similar story has to do with insects, pests, and pesticides. Once again, around the Second World War, produced DDT. Great pesticide. It really killed off mosquitoes, but then just only within a few generations, okay, not a few generations, but a few years, we have mosquitoes that are totally resistant to DDT. And this is continuing to happen, okay? This is examples of natural selection, and we'll come up with more as we go on. All right, so Darwin's ideas during his time when he produced this book, and it became now acceptable to talk about biological evolution, at least among scientists, and even among the general public. But even a good 160 years after Darwin, there's many in the general public that still reject and will not accept biological evolution, even though the evidence for it is really, really strong. Much, much stronger now than what it ever was in Darwin's day. Okay. Although his Origin of Species now made it scientifically possible to think about and study and do research on biological evolution, it was accepted as a viable theory. Many did not accept his idea of natural selection. So the real problem here was natural selection as a mechanism that explained it. And this is the reason why. Darwin had no clear idea about heredity. In fact, from last semester, what was the general idea about heredity, the major theory about heredity in Europe at that time? I went over that last semester. What was the general idea as to how heredity worked? What was the theory? You can answer in chat or you can answer verbally. Think back.
Was it that the organisms with the more beneficial traits ended up reproducing and the other ones died off?
Not quite. No, what was the way in which heredity worked?
Was it something about the blending theory?
Blending theory. The blending theory. Okay. Blending theory. Now, what would happen with the blending theory? Okay, so this is like mixing paint. Okay, it's the purple paint, white paint. They had the idea that it was some sort of the hereditary material was some sort of fluid like paint. Mix it together, then you get something in between, lavender, that isn't purple, it isn't white. And so if we had a population of organisms, okay, when I say a population, this is a localized group of individuals of the same species, and they interbreed with each other. Okay, so they're mixing their genetic material. Then what you expect from the blending theory is from generation to generation, this population, the individuals should become more and more alike because you're mixing this fluid, and soon everyone's going to be at the same type of, everyone will look the same. That was the major idea back then. But for Darwin's natural selection, it required things to be different. It requires variation. And so Darwin could not explain where this variation came from. Okay, he worked on it. He thought about it. And that required Gregor Mendel. Okay, so Gregor Mendel, we went over Mendelian genetics last semester, and it's going to play a big role here in understanding biological evolution as well, is that Mendel published his paper in 1866, okay, after Darwin. And in fact, Mendel's paper was found in Darwin's library. Okay, he had a copy of it, but he didn't understand the significance of it because Mendel's ideas explained where variation comes from. That is not like a fluid that can be mixed together. It's particulate. And we now know that those are genes in the DNA, that they do not combine in, not in the way that the fluids combine like paint, but they are particulate, but they still can mutate and be a little bit different. We have alleles, but still Mendel was discovered. Of course, his paper was discovered and understood in the early 1900s. And other individuals during the 1920s and 1930s created what we call the modern synthesis. And so from Darwin up until the modern synthesis, many people were trying to come up with other explanations as to how biological evolution takes place. So a lot of times it was mutations, usually vast mutations, okay, creating hopeful monsters, they sort of said. But during the 1920s, 1930s, modern synthesis which is still the basis of our ideas of biological evolution today, combines Darwin's natural selection and Mendelian genetics. Okay, and it has created a system where natural selection is very, very important, but it's not the only force that's leading to biological evolution, and we'll talk about that. There were others. So during this time, there were biological mathematicians. We're not going to. Don't expect you to know these names: Fisher and Wright, and we're going to see some other mathematicians that I do want you to know. Is that they created models, mathematical models, using Mendelian genetics plus Darwin's natural selection, and they were able to show mathematically how this works and how natural selection works. And so by the 1940s, what we have here is called the modern synthesis, which we still base on today. Okay. All right. So that's just a historical background. Now, before I go on any further here, let me see here. In fact, is this a good place to stop? Yeah, because I think on the next part here, it's going to take a little bit longer for me to get through it. So this is going to be where I'm going to stop for today, because we don't need to go all the way till 4 o'clock. We'll catch this up a little bit later since we went over the syllabus as well. So what I'm leading to here, I've given you the history of thoughts, and I'd like for you to know of each of these people that I've talked about. You don't need to know exactly when they lived, but you should have some concept of time. So I don't expect you to know that Plato and Aristotle were necessarily in the 5th or 4th century BCE. I just want you to know that they were old Greeks, okay, that they didn't sit down with Linnaeus to drink coffee, okay, so they were separated by time, and understand their each individual's contribution, okay. Plato, essentialism, be able to give some idea what essentialism is. Aristotle, his scale of nature, Linnaeus, his classification, and so forth. You know, those are the major things here. But before I really get into the mechanisms of biological evolution, I said that there's a lot of evidence for it, and it would take a whole semester for me to go into and show all the things that support this idea. So what I'm going into with the next few slides is the major areas, giving you some broad areas of where we have evidence for evolution, biological evolution, and give a little bit of explanation here. And we could really expand this quite a bit, but I just want to give you the categorical areas which support biological evolution. Okay. All right, so this is when I'm going to stop. And so at 9:20 tomorrow, when our lecture tomorrow starts, I will continue from this particular slide. Okay, so any questions?
Could I please see slide 6?
6? Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, anything else? Any other slide that you want to see? Okay, all right, we're started. Okay, and by this time in the afternoon, the sun is coming right in through my window. Don't I look great in the sun? All right, so I'm moving over to the shade. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop, and then I will see everyone tomorrow. I'll stay for a little bit, just in case some people are a little bit timid. Yeah, someone wants to talk to me after class. I'll stay here and talk, but then the rest of you are free to go.
Oh, Professor, one quick question. Did we have to do like a check-in like we would last semester?
I can tell that everyone is here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. A little bit later on, I may do that too. Usually Canvas saves me a record of everyone who is here, but I didn't trust Canvas, okay, and Zoom, but here I don't have to. So I know that everyone was here today. Okay, so have a good day. See everyone later.
Hi, Professor.
Okay, bye.
Professor.
Yes,
I just want to, oh, nice to meet you too. I'm like one of the
the new ones.
new ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
I took Barnby spring 2021. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, he also teaches this, and that's your lab manual. Had you been on campus, it was from me.
Yeah. Just a quick question about like Mendel. You said he explained how variations happen, right?
Well, he gave a genetic theory that allows us to understand where variation comes from.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because the Mendelian genetics, by the time we get into Mendel understood things that he came up with the idea that what we inherit for every character is some sort of particle. And of course, he didn't know that it was DNA, but it's a particulate. Okay, because when you went over his experiments with flowers, there was purple flowers, white flowers. And so there was some particle that when it's expressed, it leads to the flower being purple. And the other one, when it's expressed, is recessive allele made it white. And these two did not combine. Okay, they would combine in an individual, but the dominant allele would lead to purple, regardless of whether the white allele is there or not. And the only way white could come about is if you had two white alleles. And so that's the main thing there was the particulate theory. But then once we've built on it since then, yes, this is the genes is what leads to explaining where variation comes from.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because I was a little bit confused on the lecture
Yeah.
because I missed some parts. Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you.
When Dr. Barnby went over that, did he say anything about blending theory?
Oh yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was just in contrast to what was going on then. And of course, we're going to go into more details on the genes and how they create variation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, all right. Okay, Hamza, do you have something? I guess he forgot to log out. All right, so Long, yes, you want to.
Yes, I'm here. So you do remember? Can you hear me?
Okay, just a second here because
Hello?
you seem to be breaking up. So try it again.
Can you hear me, Professor?
Yeah, but you're breaking up sometimes. But go ahead. I probably get.
Okay, so you do remember me from the last semester,
Oh, of
right?
course, of course. I remember all
Yes.
of you. I remember all of you.
Okay. So I know that I'm not doing very great, but I'm not doing that bad too. But do you have any critical opinion on me, and as well as some
Yeah.
advice before I concentrate on the Bio 1B?
Yeah, I suspect that most of your problem is probably language.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's normal because I understand that because when I was an undergraduate in my junior year, I attended a university in Germany, and so all the instruction was in German, and I thought I knew German pretty well, but no, not until you start having to learn something in another language that it gets to be it's pretty challenging, and so I think that's probably the main problem here. And how long have you been in the United States?
It have been over 3 years, 4 years, but
4 years.
I don't think that